Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into the streets of ancient Athens, a place of public gatherings, open debates, and everyday life that turned into conversation. This is the story of Socrates, a man who asked questions more than he offered answers, and who changed the way people thought about virtue and knowledge. He had no books and no formal school, yet his questioning mind shaped his students and unsettled the powerful. Meanwhile, over time, those conversations were carried forward by others and became the foundation of a long tradition of inquiry. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Dim the lights, let the calm settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin with the life and teachings of Socrates. In the 5th century BCE, Athens was a city of many voices and many tasks. People came together in open places to speak and to listen. Citizens gathered in the assembly to decide laws. Councils met to prepare matters for public debate. At the same time, artists and builders worked on temples and public spaces. Playwrights wrote dramas for festivals. Sculptors carved marble to honor gods and important citizens. These activities took place alongside preparations for war and the aftereffects of earlier conflicts with Persia. In this way, public life and private work were closely connected. The city felt large in its activity and small in the sense that ordinary people could find a place in the conversation. Socrates was born into that city. His father was Sophroniscus, a sculptor by trade. His mother was Phaenarete, who worked as a midwife. Their household was not wealthy. It was a practical home where tools and conversation shared space. Craftsmen and their families lived near one another. They passed skills and stories from one generation to the next. Children learned workplaces and workshops as naturally as they learned the streets and the market. From early on, Socrates moved among craftsmen as much as among thinkers. He spent time where stone was shaped and where clay was formed. Meanwhile, the city offered other kinds of teachers. Poets called out lines in public festivals, and itinerant teachers came to the marketplace to offer instruction. These first sophists taught rhetoric and argument for a fee. They promised skills that could help in courts and in the assembly. Young men sometimes attended their lessons to learn to speak well in public life. Socrates watched and listened to all of this. He asked questions about the world. He wanted to know how things were made. He wanted to know how people thought and why they acted the way they did. His curiosity was practical and social at the same time. In the workshops, he learned how effort and skill changed materials. In the market and the court, he saw how words and arguments shaped decisions. Over time, these two strands, the craft of making things and the craft of speaking, combined in his way of thinking. His early teachers were not a single person or a formal school. Instead, instruction arrived through many sources. Poets taught him rhythm and memory. Teachers of music and gymnastics taught him discipline and timing. Sophists showed how public argument could win a case. Some teachers focused on nature and how the world operates. Others turned attention to human behavior and law. In this environment, ideas moved fast. Students compared what they learned in one place with what they heard in another. In this way, the mind was tested and refined. Athens itself encouraged this mixing of influences. The city valued speech and reason. Courts were public and crowded. Trials could decide a man's fate in full view of neighbors and friends. Festivals brought drama and debate. Young citizens learned to speak by speaking in public. Even the design of the city reinforced this habit. The Agora, or public market, served as a classroom where merchants, officials, and strangers exchanged views. The proximity of art and politics meant that questions about human life sat beside questions about the gods and the state. The experience of growing up was also shaped by the memory of war. Athens had fought the Persians in earlier decades of the 5th century BCE. The city had risen in reputation, and it had also paid a price. Buildings were rebuilt. New walls went up. Citizens remembered both victory and loss. These memories stayed with young Athenians. They learned to balance pride in their city with caution and practical readiness. Military service was a common expectation for male citizens. The idea of the citizen soldier belonged to the culture in a concrete way. People trained their bodies as well as their minds. Socrates absorbed these expectations and routines. He was not only interested in abstract questions. He cared about how people behaved in everyday life and how societies organized themselves. His questions often concerned practical matters. What does it mean to be just? What is courage? How should a person live among others? These questions came from watching how people acted in courts, in the assembly, and in the streets. They also came from seeing how craftsmen took care in their work. In workshops, a craftsman judged whether a piece was well made or poorly made. He tested by touch and by sight. Socrates learned to test ideas in a similar, careful way. As he grew, he also faced the new influence of the Sophists more directly. The Sophists offered instruction in persuasion and success. They traveled from city to city. Protagoras and Gorgias were two names that people often mentioned. Protagoras argued that human perception shaped what people called truth. Gorgias taught skills of speech that could unsettle listeners. Some Athenians welcomed these teachers because the city needed persuasive speakers. Others criticized them because their methods sometimes put appearance above substance. Socrates listened to both sides. He did not simply accept what the Sophists claimed. He questioned their basic assumptions and the aims of their teaching. Those early conversations shaped how Socrates would later approach teaching. He adopted a habit of asking rather than of instructing. He preferred to examine what someone believed by probing with direct questions. In this way, he sought to reveal inconsistencies or to pressure a clearer definition of what the speaker meant. The method did not depend on a set of doctrines or on an organized school. Instead, it relied on attentive listening and careful questioning. Over time, friends and acquaintances came to recognize this style. They could see that Socrates valued clarity over victory. He wanted to know what words stood for and why people accepted certain claims. The local culture also included older intellectual currents that ran through the city. Pre-Socratic philosophers had already raised questions about the natural world and the origins of things. Some thinkers looked for first principles. Others focused on moral life. The arts had also reached a high level by the middle of the 5th century BCE. Tragedies and comedies explored moral dilemmas and civic themes. Artists and architects explored proportion and balance. All of this fed into the conversation about human purpose and the organization of the city. family life contributed as well. Conversations at home often concerned practical matters: how to manage a household, how to raise children, how to make a living. Phoenerete's work as a midwife placed her in the center of life's beginnings. She would have recognized the practical and emotional dimensions of new life. Sophroniscus's work shaping stone demanded patience and attention to form. These domestic patterns helped Socrates learn how ordinary lives contained questions worth asking. He saw that ethical questions did not belong only to temples or to dramatic stages. They were part of daily routines and decisions. Schooling in this period did not follow a single program. Learning to read and write began at home or with a private tutor. Physical education took place in gymnasiums and with older citizens who taught the basics of fighting and endurance. Music and poetry were taught to refine speech and memory. The combined result was a broad formation where practical skills and public competence mattered together. For many young Athenians, the goal was to become competent citizens who could speak, debate, and defend their city if required. Socrates found his place within that mix without establishing a formal academy. He did not set up a building or write down a curriculum. Instead, he associated with various sorts of people in different parts of the city. He leaned toward conversation. Sometimes he joined groups that talked about virtue and the best life. Other times he questioned officials and young men preparing to speak in the assembly. He showed a particular interest in how everyday choices revealed character. Over time, his persistent questioning made him known throughout parts of the city. The arrival of the sophists sharpened the intellectual climate. They asked money for instruction and promised success in public life. That approach raised questions about the aim of education. Was it to secure advantage and reputation, or to pursue truth? Socrates challenged the assumption that rhetorical skill alone counted as understanding. He insisted on interrogating the meaning of terms such as justice, piety, and courage. These terms mattered because they guided action in law courts and in war. In this way, philosophical inquiry touched the core practices of civic life. As the 5th century progressed, political life grew more tense. Athens expanded its influence among other Greek cities, and it also faced rivalries that would eventually lead to prolonged conflict with Sparta. Citizens debated military strategy and alliances. Leaders rose and fell. Public mood shifted with each new crisis. Young men who had grown up under more stable conditions now faced uncertainty about service and loyalty. For someone like Socrates, these conditions posed practical and ethical questions at every turn. He watched men go to war and return changed. He watched rhetoric win votes that had real consequences. These observations fed his determination to test the clarity of public speech against the demands of action. Teachers of different kinds continued to influence the city. Rhetoricians instructed how to move an audience. Some natural philosophers pursued causes and predictions. Poets and dramatists presented complex moral scenes for public reflection. In all of these places, Socrates sought to identify what was dependable and what relied on mere taste or convenience. He did not retreat from public life. He entered it with questions that could unsettle settled opinions. At times, that unsettled people. At other times, his questions encouraged deeper thought. His early friendships were important. Allies in conversation included craftsmen, young men from various families, and older citizens who appreciated a careful mind. These friends often joined him in asking questions rather than in asserting answers. They practiced together in the Agora, in private houses, and after the performance at the theater. Over time, such gatherings shaped a modest community of inquiry. Not all of them agreed with one another. They tested claims against experience and against the judgment of others. In this way, a habit of mutual examination took root. Education in Athens valued both the mind and the body. Gymnasia prepared citizens for tasks that might require physical endurance. Musical training supported memory and rhythm. Rhetorical practice taught persuasion. The combination produced a citizenry that could act and speak. Socrates engaged with all these elements while forming his own approach. He valued practical testing of ideas as much as he valued careful definition of terms. In workshops, a craftsman used a standard to judge quality. Socrates sought a similar standard for beliefs, though he did not assume the standard would be agreed upon easily. As he approached adulthood, his style became more pronounced. He interrupted confident assertions with searching questions. He invited conversation rather than giving lectures. His attention to ordinary life distinguished him from those who wrote long treatises about the cosmos. He remained rooted in the habits of Athens: public speech, critical debate, and readiness for military service. He accepted that the city demanded practical competence. Yet he insisted that practical competence required clear thinking about ends and means. This combination of influences, family, craft, teachers, public debate, and the memory of war, made the intellectual soil in which his later work would grow. He had learned to value honest examination, to distrust unexamined claims, and to see moral questions as tied to civic duties. Meanwhile, the city continued to change. Political pressures and shifting alliances would soon demand that citizens act in ways that tested their earlier assumptions. In the years that followed, Socrates would take on new roles and face new challenges. The next part of his life shows how his habits of inquiry met the demands of military service and civic responsibility, and how those experiences shaped the way he lived among his fellow citizens. Socrates' years as a soldier belong to a period when Athens and its neighbors tested their strength and their judgment. He served as a hoplite, the heavy infantryman who stood in the shielded line. In that role, he shared the common duties of citizen soldiers: to learn formation, to hold rank, and to bear the weight of armor and shield. He went where the campaigns sent him, and the names of 3 engagements stay with his memory in the ancient accounts: Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis. Each of those places marked a different part of the long struggle between Athens and Sparta and their allies, and each left an impression on the man, who would later question the foundations of public life. At Potidaea, he experienced the close, uneasy work of siege and defense. The city lay on a narrow strip of land, and the fighting was often slow and uncertain. Soldiers stood watch for long hours. They dug, they guarded, and they faced the fatigue of waiting as much as the risk of battle. Ancient reports emphasize how ordinary soldiers endured discomfort without complaint. They drank whatever water the place offered. They kept their armor oiled and their shields patched. Socrates saw how steadiness could keep a line intact, and how the actions of many small choices determined whether a force held or broke. In this way, he learned that courage in war included more than sudden daring. It included patience, attention, and the willingness to perform ordinary tasks day after day. The fight at Delium arrived at a different moment. There the Athenians met Boeotian forces in a pitched engagement outside an allied town. The battle moved over open ground and exposed men to direct attack. Accounts from the time record confusion and sudden turns of fortune. In the midst of those movements, some soldiers performed acts now remembered as examples of bravery. Socrates was among those who stood their ground when others retreated. He was wounded, as older sources relate, and he returned from the field with the marks of battle on his body. These injuries became part of the record that told of his willingness to face danger without losing composure. At Amphipolis, the context changed again. The campaign was part of a broader strategy at a distance from Athens, and the environment tested endurance and command. Records describe hard marches, constrained supplies, and the strain of coordinating men far from home. In such a setting, a soldier's temper and sense of duty mattered as much as skill with a spear. Socrates served among men who had reputations for reckless bravery, and among men who measured success by survival. Accounts tell of him keeping to his place under pressure, and of refusing to be swept away by panic. These episodes, taken together, formed a picture of a man who met hardship without dramatic flourish, and who placed steadiness above showy acts. Stories of courage continued to travel in the city after his return. Some told how he saved comrades in the press of battle. Others described him as indifferent to cold, to hunger, and to the pain of wounds. These stories circulated in the conversations of the Agora and in the private gatherings where citizens recalled the campaigns. They did not make him famous for heroics in the way poets celebrated single moments, but they gave him a reputation for reliability. Listeners heard that he preferred to keep watch while others sought rest, and that he would carry a wounded man to safety if he could. These recollections offered a concrete demonstration of the qualities he later explored in abstract terms: duty, self-control, and steadiness. His military experience did not simply teach him how to stand on a battlefield. It also brought him face to face with political choices and the limits of public decision-making. War, by its nature, tested the institutions and leaders that had organized the city. Campaigns required resources, coordination, and judgment about risk. When decisions failed, the consequences were immediate and visible. Men lost property, rank, and life. Over time, Socrates watched how debates in the assembly and in council could produce strategies that succeeded or failed at great cost. This observation sharpened his view of the relation between speech and action. He saw how persuasive language could carry a vote, and how votes could lead to dangerous undertakings. The link between what people argued in public and what they did in war became a matter of deep concern for him. Return to Athens offered a new perspective. The city did not remain the same while its men were abroad. Political life shifted, and new factions rose and fell. Promises made in the assembly did not always match results on the ground. Some leaders showed skill in rhetoric, but little steadiness in policy. In this atmosphere, Socrates arrived with direct experience of what happens when civic decisions meet reality. The speeches that had won votes sometimes seemed distant from the practical needs of soldiers who had to carry out orders. He found that many who spoke with confidence in politics did not have the tested judgment he had seen in the line of battle. This gap produced a form of disillusionment. He did not lose his interest in the city, but he grew skeptical about the authority of public opinion when it rested on applause rather than on careful thought. These years after service deepened his reflections about justice and duty. He had seen men act out of fear, out of anger, and out of ambition. He had also seen men act out of a stable sense of obligation to one another. The difference interested him. Was justice a set of rules that could be applied mechanically? Or was it a disposition that shaped how a person faced both comfort and danger? He began to ask what duty required when demands conflicted. Should a citizen follow orders when they clearly resulted from flawed judgment? How should one balance loyalty to the city with loyalty to what is right? These questions moved him from the sphere of action into the sphere of careful examination. He wanted definitions that could guide behavior, not slogans to be repeated at the moment of crisis. Courage, too, acquired a broader meaning in his thought. The kind of bravery that stands in the front rank mattered, but so did the courage to question one's own beliefs. He recognized that fearlessness in battle could exist alongside moral confusion in peace. A man who would rush forward without a sense of what he fought for might lack a deeper form of courage. Over time, Socrates came to distinguish physical bravery from the moral habit that preserves reason under pressure. He valued the form of courage that held knowledge and temper together. This view made him critical of any account of virtue that separated action from thought. The soldier and the citizen were not different people. They were aspects of the same life that required unity of judgment. Duty, in his reflections, took on a private as well as a public dimension. In the workshop and in the home, he had seen tasks performed with care and without public recognition. The midwife, the sculptor, the small shop owner, all attended to duties that mattered to neighbors and family. He began to see justice as connected to those ordinary responsibilities as much as to large public decisions. The city required both kinds of service. A legal ruling that ignored the practices of everyday life would be thin. Conversely, private duty that avoided questions about the common good would be incomplete. In this way, his thought widened. Justice had to be rooted in the habits of the soul, and those habits had to exist in ordinary contexts as well as in public institutions. The experience of war sharpened his concern for the soul. In the field, he had observed how fear and anger could overwhelm reason. Men injured in body often suffered a change in opinion and temperament. Some turned bitter or suspicious. Others sought consolation in drink or in quick prestige. Socrates thought that these shifts revealed something important about human character. If the soul could be agitated by circumstance, then the care of the soul must be a central aim of life. Over time, he grew convinced that external success, wealth, honor, reputation, did not guarantee inner stability. A man might be celebrated in the assembly, and yet make poor choices when confronted with ethical dilemmas. This line of thought gradually led him to place the care of the soul above the pursuit of civic success. That conviction took shape slowly. He did not abandon civic concerns. He continued to attend assemblies at times, and to speak when necessary. Yet, he increasingly saw that the preparation for right action began within the person. Training a citizen to act well required internal habits that supported clear judgment. Practical training in arms and drills mattered, but so did the discipline that shaped desires and beliefs. He began to think that education should aim at forming character as much as at teaching skills. In this view, philosophy became a local project, an effort to examine what the soul needed to be steady, truthful, and just. His own method of questioning grew out of these experiences. The battlefield taught him to test claims under pressure. The assembly taught him to notice when rhetoric outpaced substance. The workshops taught him the value of repeated practice. In conversation, he adopted a habit of asking for definitions and examining them calmly. He preferred to draw out a view and then to test it by gentle interrogation. This practice did not aim to humiliate. It aimed to clarify. He believed that people could improve their judgment by subjecting their beliefs to patient scrutiny. In this way, the care of the soul became an active process that could be practiced in ordinary speech. People who knew him in the years after the war noticed a change in the subjects of his questions. Earlier, he had explored natural causes and the arts. Now he pressed more on moral terms. What is justice? What is piety? What does it mean to live well? His conversations often began with someone asserting a familiar maxim. He would then ask for an account that could be tested. These dialogues moved slowly. He asked where a definition led in practice and whether it produced consistent advice. When differences appeared, he pushed further. He valued a kind of clarity that could guide action in both private life and public office. Over time, students and friends gathered around him because they found his way of examining attractive. It called them to look at their own lives with attention rather than to accept conventional answers. This turn toward the care of the soul did not remove him from the world of politics. Instead, it reoriented his engagement. He could not ignore the failures he had seen. He continued to question leaders and citizens alike about the meaning of justice and competence. At the same time, he cultivated a practice that aimed to strengthen the inner resources of those who would take part in public life. He viewed the soul as the field where public virtues had to be planted and tended. In this respect, his activities after returning from war formed a bridge. Military duty had taught him the cost of bad decisions. Civic life had shown him where words could determine fate. Philosophy, as he came to practice it, promised a way to bring thought and action into better alignment through disciplined self-examination. Alongside these intellectual developments, his demeanor and personal habits reflected the same priorities. He maintained a simple way of living. He did not pursue honors or wealth as ends. He kept company with a range of citizens rather than with a single elite. He listened to craftsmen and to young men preparing for political life. In conversation, he focused on what people did and on how they justified their choices. Such habits made his teaching accessible to those who lived ordinary lives. They also meant that his lessons were not confined to a classroom or a formal school. In this way, his presence in the city became a continuous practice of inquiry directed toward the improvement of the soul. The next part of his life shows how these habits took more public shape. He began to move his questioning into the spaces where citizens met and where opinions formed. The Agora became, in this next phase, both a place of commerce and a place of sustained conversation. He met not only students and craftsmen, but also men of the assembly and judges who had once been comrades in the field. In the open air of the market, he continued to press for clear definitions and for consistent conduct. This shift did not end his private reflections, it amplified them. The method he had honed in years of service and civic observation now met the daily life of the city in a way that would shape his reputation, and the attention he drew from those who governed and those who obeyed. The public square, the Agora, became the place where his life unfolded day by day. Stalls and shops framed the open space. Merchants called out the prices of oil, of cloth, of fruit. Craftsmen set down their tools and sat for a while. Citizens moved through the crowd with errands and with opinions. In this setting, he took his place not as a teacher in a formal school, but as a familiar figure among the people. He did not claim a special platform. Instead, he placed himself where conversation naturally gathered. In this way, he shaped a new pattern of presence, one that made the everyday world itself the scene of philosophical inquiry. His appearance matched the simplicity of his practice. He wore plain clothing. Over time, he chose garments that required no wealth to replace. Many saw him walking barefoot through the city. Feet caked with dust or mud became a common sight. For some observers, that lack of concern for bodily comfort seemed careless. For others, it showed a deliberate turn away from unnecessary attention. In either judgment, his dress became a statement of priorities. He did not pursue the signs of status that most citizens treasured. Instead, his outward life aimed to be unobtrusive and direct. The choice to reject wealth, fame, and comfort was consistent and public. He could have accepted invitations from those who offered food, money, or a place to live. He was often urged to take honor and office. Instead, he refused. He lived with only what he needed for each day. He did not set out to shock. Rather, he wanted his life to match the questions he posed. If the good life required certain habits and judgments, then those habits should appear in the way he lived. In this way, his poverty, whether chosen or accepted by circumstance, served as a kind of proof of principle. It indicated that he was testing how little a person required to remain attentive to moral matters. Conversations followed him as he moved. Artisans left their benches to speak. A potter might pause and explain the work of shaping clay. A carpenter would step away from a measuring rod to discuss craft and truth. Soldiers who had returned from campaigns stood near and recounted events. Generals and rank-and-file men spoke in turn. Poets passed by, sometimes in a mood to trade lines. Slaves, who rarely received public attention, found themselves included in the exchanges. In this broad circle, he welcomed anyone willing to speak. He did not restrict his inquiries to a particular class or education. In this way, the city's diversity became a resource for his method. Different backgrounds provided different kinds of knowledge, and he treated these contributions as important to the questions he pursued. People reacted in several ways. Some found his interruptions irritating. He would press a point until a speaker felt exposed or embarrassed. Those who offered confident assertions sometimes left uneasy. Officials and sophists who thrived on applause resented his habit of asking for exact meaning. They complained of him as a troublemaker. Meanwhile, Others found his manner inspiring. Young men seeking a clearer life gathered around him. Craftsmen appreciated that their practical concerns were taken seriously. Men who had once admired themselves for quick answers began to reflect on whether those answers deserved their praise. The same conduct could draw both scorn and devotion. Over time, this mixed reputation became a defining feature of his presence in the Agora. What passed as casual talk in the market often functioned as teaching. He needed no lectern because instruction occurred within ordinary speech. A buyer haggling over a cloak might find the exchange turning to questions about need and value. A debate about a poem's merit could move toward what makes an action noble. In this way, everyday conversations became silent lessons in virtue. He rarely gave formal lectures. Instead, he asked for definitions and tested them through follow-up questions. Listeners who engaged with him found that common remarks took on a new weight. A simple claim about courage, for instance, would be examined until the practical implications were clear. The point was not to display cleverness, but to bring ordinary speech under closer scrutiny so that conduct might change. The range of those who spoke with him widened the lessons. When a general described the proper moment to withdraw in battle, he pressed for what judgment required in conditions of danger. His questions did not assume technical military knowledge. Instead, they sought the standards by which a choice could be called wise or rash. A craftsman's rule of thumb about measuring might lead to a discussion of skill and deliberation. A poet's line about honor might prompt a request for the conditions under which honor is deserved rather than merely asserted. Even a slave's account of household duty could provide examples of fidelity and restraint. Each conversation supplied material for examining the norms that guided life. In these exchanges, his voice was steady and patient. He did not shout his conclusions. Questions came in a low, persistent manner. For many listeners, this tone made the experience of being questioned less threatening. For others, it increased their irritation by exposing the fragility of their claims. He had a habit of returning to a question until the interlocutor had gone beyond a surface answer. In this way, he trained people to speak with precision. Over time, this practice produced a habit in his companions. They began to think before they spoke. That modest change in conversation had broader consequences for how citizens approached decisions in assemblies and courts. Silence often followed these interrogations, not because he wanted to dominate, but because reflection had been invoked. When a man realized that a term used carelessly could not bear the weight of action, he tended to pause. Those pauses were not theatrical. They were moments in which speech yielded to thought. In many household and workshop settings, people came to expect that a discussion with him would end with practical consequences. A son who had boasted of cleverness might return to an apprenticeship with a new sense of humility. A magistrate who had relied on rhetoric could reconsider the standards he applied in judgment. In this way, everyday conversations became agents of moral formation without formal endorsement. The image of him, as both annoying and inspiring, extended beyond the Agora. Writers and thinkers who came later recorded anecdotes that captured both sides. Some stories emphasized his sharp cross-examinations. Others celebrated the way he helped young people to see contradictions in their beliefs. No single portrait fully captured him. Different witnesses emphasized the moments that mattered to them. For a shopkeeper, the detail that lingered might be a correction to a claim about fair price. For a student, the memory might be of being led toward greater consistency in thought. These varying impressions created a reputation that was itself capable of teaching. People learned about the practice before they experienced it, and that prior knowledge shaped their expectations. His habit of mixing with many social groups complicated common ways of measuring influence. He had no official students in the modern sense, and yet he attracted a circle of young men who sat and listened for hours. Some of these companions came from wealthy families and others from modest homes. The combination mattered. A dialogue conducted among peers of different status tested whether a view held across social lines. He valued these mixed groups because the pressure of different experiences exposed what was merely conventional. Meanwhile, the presence of public figures among his listeners drew attention to what ordinary citizens could learn by listening well. Over time, the social variety of his interlocutors helped to show that moral inquiry need not belong to a single class. Materially, his life remained simple. He accepted and gave only small favors. He declined gifts that came with expectations. If someone insisted, he might take a meal, but he avoided long-term dependence. In this way, his habits reinforced a principle. Inquiry required independence of interest. When a man's livelihood depended on pleasing a patron, his judgments tended to bend toward flattery. He attempted to remove that pressure from his own circumstances. He wanted to make clear that the pursuit of truth should not be traded for comforts that demanded silence or submission. Over time, people learned that his lack of attachment to wealth made him freer to ask the kinds of questions others avoided. His public presence also tested civic norms in quieter ways. When he spoke to a magistrate or stood near those who exercised power, he did not flinch. He asked the same kinds of questions of a dignitary as of a stonecutter. That practice unsettled the idea that some people were beyond inquiry. The assembly had its rituals and its offices, and yet he showed that the standards by which decisions were made could and should be examined. This stance contributed to a reputation for disrespect among some, and for civic courage among others. It also placed him in recurring tension with institutional forms of authority. He did not seek to overturn those forms by force. Instead, he aimed to strengthen them by insisting that their language match their intentions. Children and older women, men in armor and men in rags, all became part of his audience at different moments. He spoke with an elderly potter, and then turned to a young student who wanted to be a speaker in the assembly. He listened to a foreigner who had come to trade, and he questioned a poet who was reciting verses. The variety reminded listeners that philosophy was not an elite pursuit. The community of speech that formed around him was inclusive in the sense that it needed practical perspectives to test abstract claims. In this way, public life and private character were kept in conversation, rather than separated into different spheres. As these encounters accumulated, a pattern emerged. Casual speech, under his questioning, became disciplined speech. The habit of asking for clearer definitions moved slowly through the city. Not everyone adopted it, and many resisted. Yet the presence of people who had been taught to ask for reasons changed the tone of neighborhoods. Family arguments, commercial bargains, and court disputes all began to include a new expectation that claims should be backed by a coherent account. This expectation did not always produce agreement, but it encouraged a kind of collective attention to the reasons for action. Over time, citizens who had once accepted conventional sayings found it harder to do so without examination. Those who learned to respond to his questioning reported different internal changes. Some acquired a stronger inclination to hold themselves accountable. Others developed a habit of checking their beliefs for consistency. A few discovered the discomfort of recognizing that long-held opinions could not survive scrutiny. These personal adjustments, multiplied across households and workshops, mattered for how the city deliberated. The practice of careful speech had implications for legal decisions, for public counsel, and for the everyday ways people treated one another. In this manner, his ordinary conversations functioned like small institutions, informal, persistent, and focused on the conduct of citizens. The social cost of this activity was real. Some neighbors avoided him to keep peace. Others publicly criticized him for what they called excessive questioning. He sometimes lost polite company or invitations. Yet he did not seek popularity. Instead, he cultivated a presence that made his questions available to those who wanted them. The absence of a formal school meant that his influence depended on personal encounter. People met him, listened, and often carried his way of inquiry into their own circles. Over time, those circles overlapped and produced a modest network of practitioners who treated the life of examination as central to living well. Through all of this, his manner and habits continued to reflect a single aim: to align speech and action by cultivating a mind that paid attention. He did not reduce virtue to a formula. Rather, he pursued a steady process of testing claims so that habits could be grounded in understanding. In the Agora, his life provided ongoing examples of what such grounding required. A market conversation about price could lead to a question about fairness. A discussion of poetry might end in an assessment of moral seriousness. These transitions were not abrupt. They moved slowly and often left many details unresolved. Yet that unhurried movement marked the practice. It offered a way for citizens to rehearse judgments in the course of ordinary life. In this manner, his presence in the public square prepared the ground for what would come next in his work. The steady habit of questioning, the refusal of honors, the inclusion of many voices, and the conversion of casual talk into disciplined speech shaped a method of inquiry that had social as well as intellectual aims. The daily practice in the Agora had done more than draw attention. It had begun to change how people thought about moral responsibility. With these habits in place, and with a growing circle of companions ready to pursue deeper questions, the scene was set for a more systematic development. The next phase would move from dispersed conversations to a clearer articulation of method. As the practices honed in the market turned into a sustained way of examining belief and guiding life. From the habits formed in the market and in the port, a clearer aim gradually took shape. Conversations were no longer merely occasions for exchange. They became tests of the words people used. He turned repeatedly to a small set of questions that mattered to the life of the city. What is justice? What is courage? What is goodness? These questions were simple in appearance, but he treated them as points where practice and speech met. In this way, ordinary claims were invited to stand under examination. He began by asking for definitions. He would ask a man who praised an action to say what he meant by praise. A citizen who admired a general's behavior would be asked to state what courage actually was. A poet celebrated for noble lines would find himself pressed to explain what made an action noble rather than merely praised. These invitations to define were not exercises in technical vocabulary. Instead, they were attempts to locate the core of a concept. A clear definition, in his view, made possible clearer living. The method he used was steady and precise. It had a pattern. First, a term was proposed. Then he would ask for an example, and for a general account that covered the example. Next came a series of probing questions that followed the implications of that account. When an inconsistency appeared, he pointed it out. Over time, the chain of questions often showed that the initial definition could not sustain the claims attached to it. In this way, contradictions were exposed. Exposing contradiction was not a display of cleverness. It aimed to clear away confused assumptions so that a more reliable account might be sought. This procedure has a name in later writings, but the familiar element was the practice itself. By showing that commonly accepted answers failed under careful scrutiny, he opened space for more precise thought. People who had been confident in their own words sometimes found themselves speechless. That silence was telling. It signaled either the need to refine a view or the recognition that a phrase had been used without attention. In many cases, the result was not an immediate answer, but a state of puzzlement that made further inquiry necessary. An event in his life provided a frame for the work he undertook. A friend had once asked the Delphic oracle whether anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the response recorded was that no one was wiser. He did not accept this as praise in the ordinary sense. Instead, he tested it by seeking out those who were reputed wise. When he questioned poets, politicians, and craftsmen, he found that each had skill or reputation in a narrow domain. Yet none could claim a consistent understanding of the virtues that governed the city's life. From this, he drew a conclusion that shaped his aim. Wisdom begins with recognizing one's own ignorance. That realization changed the tone of his practice. He did not pretend to possess secure knowledge about all matters. He declared a kind of intellectual modesty. At the same time, he committed himself to continual questioning. Recognizing ignorance in his hands became the starting point for investigation rather than a comfortable resignation. In this way, acknowledging not knowing was a form of ethical seriousness. It licensed further effort to find what, if anything, could withstand scrutiny. A central difference became clear between his work and that of the sophists, who were well known in Athens. Sophists taught the arts of speaking and persuasion for a fee. They trained men to succeed in the assembly and in court by shaping public opinion. Their interest lay largely in effectiveness. He, by contrast, refused to accept payment for instruction. He made little use of rhetorical flourish. His aim was not to win a case or to secure influence by charm. Instead, he sought the conditions under which a claim could be shown to be true or false. This difference mattered to many observers. Critics argued that his questions undermined confidence and upset customary life. Supporters saw him as pursuing a different end, truth rather than victory. To illustrate how his questioning worked, the memories recorded by friends provide specific cases. In a conversation that later became known by the name Euthyphro, a young man claimed he knew what piety was. He offered an initial account, saying that piety was what the gods loved. This definition seemed simple enough. Yet when questioned, the young man had to face the fact that the gods disagreed among themselves about many things. If what the gods loved could vary, then love by gods could not establish a stable account of piety. The exchange left a sense that a deeper account was required. The effect on the young man was not merely rhetorical embarrassment. It was an invitation to re-examine assumptions about religious duty and justice. In another recorded exchange concerned with courage, two experienced soldiers offered rival accounts. One described courage as steady endurance in battle. Another emphasized the role of reason and judgment in brave acts. He pressed both men to reconcile their views with situations where endurance without judgment would be foolish, or where careful judgment without force might still count as bravery. These questions did not dismiss practical skill. They demanded that the concept of courage be broad enough to account for the different cases in which people label acts courageous. For many listeners, this tightened awareness of what terms actually signified. The dialogue known as Meno explored whether virtue can be taught. At first, the question seemed practical and immediate. The exchange began with a young man confident in his own ability to define virtue, and it moved toward a more puzzling conclusion. People could not easily say what virtue itself was. The discussion then led to considerations about knowledge, learning, and the possibility that some understanding might be a matter of recollection rather than instruction. Whether one accepts every conclusion that later writers attributed to that exchange, the practical effect was clear. Men who heard the argument were drawn to ask whether moral knowledge depends on technical training or on a deeper capacity of the soul. The exchanges with the sophists showed sharper contrasts. In a well-known confrontation with Protagoras and with other teachers of rhetoric, the method showed how persuasive skill could be separated from truth. He would allow an opponent to speak at length. Then, by asking about the general principles underlying a claim, he revealed instances where persuasive speech misled, or where a victory in argument did not translate into moral improvement. The result unsettled students of rhetoric and raised questions for citizens about whom to trust when decisions affected the common good. These recorded conversations had real effects on the people involved. A young man who had been proud of his quick answers might go away humbled and thoughtful. A politician who relied on polished speeches could find his arguments probed in public until he revised his rhetoric. An artisan who respected his craft could learn to apply the same care of definition to moral matters. Over time, participation in such dialogues changed how individuals spoke and how they judged one another. The immediate lesson was modest. It did not produce a single system of answers. Rather, it shaped a method of examining claims that others could adopt. Two personal qualities stood out in his practice and affected the tone of each exchange. One was irony. He often began by professing ignorance. He asked questions that suggested he did not grasp the matter at hand. This feigned simplicity compelled others to explain more fully than they might otherwise. In this way, hidden assumptions became visible. The second quality was humility. He did not boast of greater wisdom. When a speaker supplied an argument that satisfied the test, he acknowledged it. He praised clarity when it appeared. The combination produced a striking balance. His irony could unsettle, yet his humility kept the exercise from becoming mere triumphalism. Persistence was the third quality that shaped the process. He returned to questions again and again. When a definition failed, he did not simply dismiss the speaker. Instead, he pressed further to see whether a revised account might endure. This perseverance had a practical aim. It sought not to embarrass, but to build a reasoned account that could guide action. Over time, the steady insistence on careful definition trained companions to maintain attention to reasons in their own decisions. The distinction between exposing contradiction and mere ridicule was important to his practice. He did not aim to mock a person. Rather, he showed that a claim could not bear the consequences implied by everyday life. When a juror used a convenient phrase to justify a sentence, the questions aimed to reveal whether that phrase could guide consistent judgment. When a father invoked a proverb to excuse harsh treatment of a child, the scrutiny asked whether the proverb applied in the particular circumstances. In this way, the method stayed attached to practice rather than turning into abstract verbalisms. His work produced varied public responses. Admirers praised the clarity that came from careful inquiry. They reported improvements in speech and conduct. Critics, on the other hand, accused him of unsettling the young and showing disrespect for established norms. Some sophists resented his refusal to accept payment and his unwillingness to compete on their terms. Others feared that his habit of questioning respected authorities weakened public trust. These tensions eventually took a political form, as his method came into conflict with those who equated social stability with unexamined traditions. His relationship with youth was one place where both praise and suspicion met. Young men sought him out because his questions offered a discipline of mind. They found their confidence reshaped into a capacity for careful judgment. At the same time, elders worried that his influence encouraged inappropriate skepticism toward those in office. That suspicion was not only a matter of age. It reflected a deeper concern about the role of dissent in civic life. The balance between necessary criticism and destructive destabilization was not always clear, and debates over this balance followed his work. Through these practices, he gradually formed a reputation for a method rather than for a doctrine. People who met him learned to expect questions that aimed at definitions and at testing consistency. When a person learned this habit, it often spread. A friend who had been corrected would, in ordinary conversation, begin to ask for clearer accounts. Families and workshops adopted a new willingness to examine common sayings. Over time, this spread of method affected how the city talked about justice and duty. The recordings made by later companions preserved both the method and its immediate human effects. Some dialogues show success. A speaker reaches a more careful account and modifies his behavior. Others end in puzzlement, and yet even such unresolved discussions served a purpose. Leaving a question open signaled that a topic required more attention than casual talk would allow. The absence of definitive answers did not mean failure. It indicated that understanding often requires sustained effort over time. In the midst of these practices, his personal commitment remained visible. He did not take honors, and he refused normal markers of status. He continued to live modestly and to welcome anyone who would engage. His stance reinforced the claim that inquiry should not be bought or sold. It also made clear that the pursuit of understanding was an independent activity, supported by persistent questioning rather than by patronage. As the method became clearer and more widely experienced, it created an expectation that public language should be accountable to reason. Citizens who had been exposed to the approach tended to demand clearer justifications in courts and assemblies. Even those who resisted might find themselves required to adjust their speech when pressed. Over time, the habit of asking for definitions improved the quality of public deliberation, at least in certain circles. It did not eliminate controversy, yet it introduced a standard that speech should be able to bear examination. This phase of his life set the scene for the next developments. The steady insistence on clear definitions, the refusal to accept paid instruction, the experiments with questioning across social boundaries, and the practice of humility mixed with irony together formed a distinctive method. His companions began to gather more often and to carry the questions into other settings. The work that had started in markets and at benches was now ready to move into more sustained forms of study and dialogue. With that shift, the circle that followed him began to take a clearer shape and to prepare for deeper inquiry. A small circle began to form around him, and it took shape slowly rather than by design. Men from different backgrounds found their way to the same conversations. Some came out of curiosity, others out of admiration, and a few followed from habit. Over time, certain names became closely associated with his presence. Among them were Plato, Xenophon, Alcibiades, and Critias. Each arrived with a distinct temperament. Each left with a different relation to the questions that filled the days. Plato came as a young man with a careful mind and an appetite for sustained attention. He listened more than he spoke at first. When he did speak, his answers showed a hunger for clarity. He took to recording dialogues later on, but in the circle, his habit was to hold a question and explore its range. Under the steady pressure of repeated questioning, Plato learned to set out arguments and to test them in detail. He watched how conclusions could be tightened and how loose speech could be reshaped into more exact claim. In this way, his thought acquired a methodical quality. Over time, he gathered the habit of examining assumptions before building further steps, and that practice marked his later work. Xenophon came from a different place. He had seen military service and practical organization. His sense of the world was shaped by action and responsibility. In conversation, he valued examples drawn from experience. He admired the moral seriousness of the questioning and often recorded practical lessons that could be applied to life. Where Plato leaned toward theoretical structure, Xenophon retained a focus on conduct and clear guidance. He preserved memories of his teacher that emphasized behavior, temperance, and the everyday applications of careful speech. That practical orientation made his accounts distinct and approachable to many listeners. Alcibiades entered the circle with charisma and ambition. He was striking in manner and bold in speech. Socrates treated him with attention rather than flattery. Through repeated exchanges, Alcibiades found himself confronted by questions that exposed tensions between desire and self-control. He admired the freedom of thought that the discussions encouraged, yet he also struggled with the discipline the questions required. Socrates' occasional irony and patient insistence did not prevent laughter or warmth. Still, Alcibiades' eagerness for honor and success contrasted sharply with the teacher's call for examined life. That contrast shaped both men's relationship and over time became a source of public notice. Critias came from an aristocratic background and carried a different set of concerns. He had an interest in law and governance, and he looked to conversation for intellectual refinement. In private discussion, he showed sharpness and a readiness to argue for political ends. Socrates' probing forced him to articulate the principles that underlay his positions. At first, this produced refinement. Later, under different pressures, it contributed to choices that distanced him from the circle's ethical aims. The early exchanges, however, reveal how the method could produce precision in public argument, and how that precision could be used in various directions, not all of them benign. Each relationship was personal and particular. Socrates did not teach a class in the modern sense. He did not deliver set lectures from a platform. Instead, instruction occurred in the course of ordinary life. Discussions began in the gymnasium after exercise, where men sat down to recover their breath and exchange thought. They took place in the workshops of craftsmen during pauses from labor. They happened by the city's benches and at the gates of temples, as well as in private homes over simple meals. Sometimes a question rose from a passing remark. At other times, a meeting was sought for the explicit purpose of inquiry. The settings varied, and so did the tone. In a workshop, the conversation could be brisk and focused on practical consequences. In a dining room, it might be more leisurely, moving around ethical subtleties. Meanwhile, the public spaces produced exchanges that touched on law, justice, and civic duty. The manner of teaching depended as much on presence as on method. He taught by living as he questioned. His actions and his way of relating became part of the lesson. He refused fees and would not accept honors. He lived simply. He wore no special garb. He made hardly any claim to rank. In this way, his conduct provided a continuous lesson in modesty and commitment to inquiry. Students observed not only how he argued, but how he met fortune, misfortune, and ordinary interruption. That practical model showed pupils how to integrate questioning into daily life, rather than to treat it as an occasional pastime. His charm was a part of this presence. He combined clarity with a human warmth that made long conversations bearable and often pleasurable. He could laugh at a mistake without cruelty. He used gentle mockery at times, and in other moments, he displayed an unforced gaiety that relaxed the most tense exchange. Humor appeared in small gestures, in a readiness to smile when an answer went wrong, and in the occasional witty retort. It was not a show. It was a means of keeping people engaged. His patience was equally notable. He would repeat a question, allow a pause, and invite further thought. When a speaker grew flustered, he did not seize the argument, but rather returned to the fundamental terms and asked the same simple question again. This combination of charm and patience made his presence memorable. That presence, in turn, shaped the pattern of discussions. In private, the mood often allowed for candor. Youths confessed uncertainty. older men measured their words more carefully. There was a sense that inquiry could be pursued without immediate consequence. Meanwhile, public exchanges could be sharper. When politicians or craftsmen answered in the market, the pressure of reputation and immediate decision-making altered the dynamic. He adapted to each context. He could press a leading citizen in the assembly with a steady series of questions, and he could welcome a craftsman into a detailed technical discussion in a workshop. The same method and the same habits applied across social divisions, and that consistency reinforced the idea that questioning belonged to all areas of life. The variety of effects on his followers showed how personal temperament mattered. Plato adopted the rigor of definition and extended it into theoretical work. Xenophon preserved a practical ethos and translated the questions into advice for conduct. Alcibiades carried the lessons into high politics, sometimes with confusion and always with dramatic consequence. Critias used the training in rhetorical and legal precision, but his later political choices reflected a departure from the ethical tone that had originally animated the exchanges. These divergent paths illustrate that teaching by living example can be influential without determining all outcomes. In this way, influence was not a simple transfer of doctrine, but a complex shaping of habits and dispositions. Admiration spread through parts of the city. Young men sought instruction, and older friends praised his commitment to careful speech. Visitors remarked on improvements in temper and judgment among those who spent time in his company. Everyday talk changed where his method had taken hold. People began to ask for clearer accounts in courts and assemblies. Meanwhile, his refusal to accept money made certain that his practice could be presented as independent from the pursuit of reward. For many, that independence enhanced his credibility. In this way, admiration had a public face. At the same time, suspicion grew. Critics charged that his questions undermined accepted authority and encouraged disrespect. Sophists were quick to note the similarity of public questioning, and some accused him of operating close to their trade. Others feared that his influence over the young promoted a kind of restlessness. The same qualities admired by friends were seen by opponents as dangerous. Irony, for instance, which in private could produce laughter and self-correction, in public could appear as insolence towards traditional beliefs. His refusal to teach for pay attracted jealousy from those who made a living from instruction. In addition, the fact that some of the young men associated with him later entered politics in ways that alarmed many citizens created further grounds for criticism. This mix of admiration and hostility produced complex social dynamics. Friends defended him as a necessary corrective to careless thinking. They pointed to improvements in speech and conduct among his followers. Critics replied by pointing to specific cases in which a student's character or political choices seemed to contradict the moral tone of the conversations. Over time, the lines hardened. Supporters gathered more committedly around him, and opponents sharpened their complaints. Public conversations that once looked harmless now acquired a political charge. People began to speak of his circle as a force within the city, rather than as an informal group of questioners. The public nature of some exchanges made the tension inevitable. When questions probed officials or lawgivers in the market, they touched on matters of authority. when a young man influenced by the method debated in the assembly. Observers asked whether he had been shaped for civic improvement or for disruptive criticism. In this way, the practice moved from the private bench to a wider scene of political judgment. That movement was gradual, and it was not uniform. Certain neighborhoods and circles welcomed the discipline of reason. Others recoiled from what they saw as subversion, while the circle continued to meet. And while private friendships remained strong, the larger climate of the city began to shift. Conversations that had been tolerated as a feature of Athenian life started to be read in more charged terms. Accusations and defenses coexisted. Discussions in the gymnasium and in workshops went on, but now they occurred under the shadow of public scrutiny. In some corners, the method was praised as a civic good. In others, it was suspected of eroding traditional loyalties. These competing views set the stage for further conflict. The emergence of this tension naturally led to questions about the limits of inquiry in a polis governed by law and custom. Citizens asked whether the habit of relentless questioning served the common good or whether it weakened the foundations of civic cohesion. At the same time, his friends continued to press for clearer reasoning in public affairs. The difference between private moral training and public political consequence grew ever more pressing. As these pressures accumulated, events would unfold that tested both his method and the city's tolerance for dissent. In this way, the circle's life moved toward a moment where the philosopher's practice and the city's expectations would come into sharper conflict, and the next phase of the story opens upon that confrontation. Athens had emerged from war with an exhaustion that showed in public life. The Peloponnesian conflict had ended less than a decade earlier, and the city still bore the weight of defeat, division, and enforced change. Political leaders who had been tested by crisis returned to debate in the assembly, while many citizens nursed private grievances. Over time, blame moved through neighborhoods and workshops, and resentment settled into routines of suspicion. The memory of the brief rule of the 30 tyrants lingered in daily conversation. Some feared a return to arbitrary power. Others felt betrayed by those who had once promised reform. In this atmosphere, even ordinary acts of speech could be read as signs of disloyalty. Against that background, a new fear took shape, one less about armies and more about ideas. Where public discussion had once been broad and, in many places, vigorous, a sense of caution began to appear. Citizens asked whether certain debates weakened social trust. Meanwhile, others simply worried that the wrong words at the wrong time might lead to trouble. In this way, a general anxiety about novelty and dissent moved through the city. The memory of recent political upsets made people less willing to welcome unconventional thinking. Suspicion attached easily to those who questioned established claims, and repeated questioning began to seem less like a service and more like a threat. Socrates' practice had always relied on open discussion. He tested ideas in public spaces and in private company. Over time, that habit collided with the new timidity. For some listeners, his manner remained a corrective and a help. For others, it appeared destabilizing. The charge that finally reached the courts summarized this division in blunt terms. He was accused of corrupting the youth and of introducing new gods. These were legal formulations with a civic resonance. To many citizens, the charges named a possible source of social harm. To his friends, they sounded like misunderstandings or political attacks. The trial itself, therefore, became a measure of the city's patience with critical speech. The formal process began on a warm spring day in 399 BCE. The city gathered in the court with the ordinary noise of petitioners and officials. The jury was large and drawn from the citizenry. Prosecution speeches named specific complaints. They argued that the young men who associated with Socrates had adopted habits that threatened traditional reverence for the laws and for the gods honored by the city. Some witnesses pointed to the behavior of particular pupils who had later acted in ways that alarmed their neighbors. Others connected his questioning to broader changes in manners and speech. In this way, argument moved from personal critique to a public accusation, and the atmosphere tightened. Socrates' response was calm and deliberate. He stood in the familiar posture of a man who had long practiced examination rather than persuasion by force. He did not plead for mercy. He did not beg the jury to spare him because of age or family ties. Instead, he addressed charges by a mixture of question and explanation. In this way, he sought to show how the accusations either misread his actions or failed to capture their purpose. He described his practice not as a career, but as a vocation of inquiry. He explained how he engaged his companions to test claims about justice, courage, and the good life. When asked whether he acknowledged new divine beings, he spoke of the inner sign that had guided him, a private restriction he had respected, without claiming it as public teaching. His defense rested less on rhetorical flourish than on an attempt to make the jury understand the logic of his method. The method itself resisted the neat categories of the courtroom. He asked for definitions, probed inconsistencies, and led interlocutors through consequences. At times, his irony exposed the limits of common opinion. At other moments, he accepted contrary answers and pushed further. In the court, he used this familiar technique to turn accusations into questions about the nature of corruption and the meaning of piety. He invited jurors to consider what it meant to lead a good life, and whether his own life worked against the city's welfare. When he spoke of the youth, he argued that the formation of character required steady practice in self-examination, and that his influence aimed to strengthen rather than weaken moral capacities. One of the phrases that he offered during his defense became a kind of touchstone. He said that the unexamined life is not worth living. The sentence is brief and carries a direct force. He meant that living without reflection about one's choices leaves a person subject to habit and to untested impulses. Over time, such an unreflective existence could lead to error and harm. In his view, inquiry had a practical function. It trained attention to reasons and to consequences. It kept desires subject to judgment. In this way, self-examination worked as a form of moral care. He believed that a city that tolerated only unreflective life risked dulling the capacities that make citizens responsible and wise. That claim struck at a deeper tension between individual conscience and the rhythm of public opinion. Socrates insisted that conscience had to be cultivated by solitary thought and by honest conversation. Public judgment, by contrast, could be shaped by fear, by immediate advantage, or by the pressure of habit. He suggested that a person ought to act according to the best reasons they could discern, even when those reasons differed from what the crowd expected. Yet he also recognized that citizens live together and that public norms play a role in shaping conduct. The contrast between inner conviction and communal expectation therefore posed a hard question. When should one defer to the community, and when should one insist on independent judgment? In the courtroom, he answered that question through example more than formula. He recounted his obedience to laws in many ordinary matters. At the same time, he refused to abandon the practice of questioning where it seemed necessary. He described his daemonion, the inward sign, as a restraint from certain actions rather than a general endorsement of unusual divinities. He also refused to claim divine authority for his teaching. Instead, he presented himself as a citizen whose work consisted in pointing out inconsistencies and urging clearer speech. In this way, his conscience guided him without seeking to impose a private religion on others. That stance was meant to narrow the gap between private conviction and public duty, but it did not eliminate the possibility of conflict. The jury listened, and the fate of the trial turned on the tension between sympathy and suspicion. Some jurors seemed impressed by his calm and his refusal to flatter. Others remained suspicious, perhaps because they associated his questioning with recent political disruptions. The vote was close. A majority found him guilty. The sentence to be determined after conviction opened another moral dimension. Athenian legal procedure allowed the accused to propose an alternative to the prosecutor's suggested penalty. In this way, the court might temper punishment and offer the convicted some choice in the matter of consequence. Socrates' proposal for a penalty reflected his characteristic steadiness. He rejected the idea of draining sympathy through melodrama. He suggested modest support from his friends, and he joked at one point about being entitled to free meals once a year for life as a public benefactor, a reference to old civic honors. The offer was not sincere as a bargain. It functioned instead as an extension of his method, placing the choice of punishment within the frame of reasoned exchange. Meanwhile, his opponents pressed for death. They argued that his influence could not be tolerated and that the city's safety required a decisive answer. The jurors sided with them, and the sentence of death was pronounced. The verdict had moral implications that reached beyond the man and into the shape of civic life. For his supporters, the outcome showed that the city could mistake dissent for danger, and that public fear could override careful judgment. For critics, the decision appeared necessary to safeguard customs and to deter what they saw as corrosive tendencies. The case therefore became a test of how a democracy balanced free inquiry with communal stability. It also raised questions about the role of law when passions and historical memory shaped interpretation more than careful argument. In the days that followed the formal judgment, in private homes and in public corners, citizens discussed what had happened. Some defended the jury as upholding what they took to be a reasonable standard of respect for the gods and the laws. Others saw the outcome as a failure of the political imagination, a moment when prudence gave way to the easier security of conformity. The conversation highlighted the delicate edge on which civic freedom rested. Over time, the event would be remembered differently by different groups, and each retelling would reveal something about the teller's priorities and fears. For Socrates himself, the verdict demanded a response that matched his lifelong commitment to examination. He accepted the decision without seeking flight or evasion. He argued that obeying the city's sentence was part of respecting the laws that had shaped him, even while he maintained the distinction between inner conviction and public pressure. At the same time, he left open an ethical claim that reason and conscience should guide one's actions above mere social acceptance. In this way, his conduct after the verdict reinforced, rather than contradicted, the principles he had long held. The judgment also affected his followers and the broader circle of friends and students. Some felt stunned and bereft. Others discussed plans for intervention. A few suggested escape or exile. Yet he discouraged schemes that would undermine the very legal order he otherwise criticized. His position did not deny the injustice some perceived in the verdict, but it did insist on a consistency of action. He preferred to meet the city's choice with the same temper he had shown in life. That choice revealed an ethical coherence that left his companions to wrestle with the relationship between loyalty to principle and the demands of political prudence. Over the next hours and days, the city settled into a quieter routine, but the orbit of the trial continued to influence speech and behavior. People altered the way they spoke in assemblies. Teachers minded the kinds of questions they raised in public. Young men who had once followed him considered how to carry the lessons of inquiry forward while navigating a civic climate less tolerant of apparent subversion. Meanwhile, those who had opposed him felt vindicated and more confident in curbing what they considered dangerous innovation. In this way, the verdict reshaped norms even as it closed a chapter in one man's life. The story did not end with the verdict. The coming days would test practical choices about obedience, defiance, and friendship. Some of those choices would be personal and immediate. Others would have lasting effects on the memory of the city, and on the way, later generations thought about the relation between conscience and law. The narrative thus moved from courtroom procedure into the intimate spaces of final visits, parting words, and the small acts that give shape to an ending. In the next phase, the daily sequence of final hours would unfold with the same clarity and seriousness that had marked the trial itself, and attention would focus on how a life governed by inquiry met the reality of death, and on what meaning that meeting might hold for those who remained. After the trial, Socrates was taken to the prison where he was to spend the last days allowed by the city. The place was simple and secure. Guards came and went at set hours. Light entered through narrow openings. In this setting, he received visits from friends and followers who moved between quiet conversation and practical concern. Some arrived early in the morning and sat for hours. Others came at night, bringing news, questions, or small comforts. They brought bowls of food and the modest things the law permitted. They also brought records of the day and the day before, the slow, ordinary business of a city that had decided his fate but not yet carried out the sentence. Those visits were not only about comfort, they were opportunities for conversation. Men who admired his practice wanted to speak with him one more time. Young followers asked questions with the mixture of earnestness and uncertainty that had marked their studies. Older friends listened more and spoke less. Meanwhile, other visitors tried to plan. One of them, Crito, took it as his duty to think about practical options. He had come with money and with persuasion. He had come with a sense that the loss of his friend could be avoided. In this way, the visits moved between consolation, argument, and the exercise of daily cares. Crito pressed the case for escape with a combination of urgency and detail. He worried for the safety of Socrates' friends and for the reputation of those who had failed to act. He argued that a timely flight would spare shame from the household, that public opinion would be kinder if Socrates were known to have left rather than died under the sentence, and that exile in another city would allow him to continue his work. He had calculated the means to bribe guards or to secure a boat. He counted on allies and on the willingness of friends to hide him. He named the responsibilities Socrates had to his family and to his children. He insisted that there was no true necessity in the execution that could not be averted by prompt action. Socrates met each point with a steady logic that combined ethical principle and civic reflection. He did not act out of stubbornness or a desire for spectacle. Instead, he examined the reasons Crito offered and the assumptions that lay behind them. One question he raised asked whether it was right for a good man to do wrong in return for wrong, as by escaping in violation of the laws. Another asked whether public opinion or careful judgment should determine one's actions. He reminded his friend that it mattered what the right action was, not merely what was safe or popular. Beyond these moral inquiries, Socrates also considered what flight would mean in relation to the laws of the city. He pictured, as a thought experiment, the laws speaking as if they were persons who had nurtured him since childhood. He argued that to break them would be to break an agreement that had shaped his life. He suggested that he had benefited from the protection and order the laws provided, even when he had criticized them. To leave now, without attempting to persuade them by lawful means, would be to treat the laws as if they had no authority. In this way, his reasoning linked private conscience to public obligation, and to the implicit contract that binds citizens and laws together. Crito continued to press on the practical details. He pointed out the pain his death would cause loyal companions and the difficulty his children would face without a father. Socrates acknowledged those concerns. He spoke of family duties and of the feelings of those left behind. Yet he maintained that the right action could not be chosen on the basis of fear, loss, or shame alone. He asked his friend to consider whether the escape would be an honorable act and whether it would be just if done against the laws. In this way, he turned the immediate plea for safety into a longer inquiry about the meaning of duty and about the nature of justice itself. Over time, the discussion also took a moral form familiar to his prior examinations. He invited Crito to distinguish between what is pleasant and what is just. He argued that friends should not counsel a man to do wrong even when the wrong would spare him. He insisted that the good must be sought for its own sake, and that an action should be judged by its justice rather than by its results. In this manner, he refused to accept escape as a solution. His refusal had practical consequences. It removed one immediate source of worry for his friends and reinforced the idea that his life had been governed by principles rather than convenience. After this decision, conversation returned to the themes that had most concerned his followers. They wished to know about the soul and its future. Phaedo and other friends had hoped to hear him speak about the immortality of the soul, and the gathering in the prison formed the setting for a longer philosophical exchange. The conversation unfolded with a careful pace. Men sat and listened as Socrates presented a series of arguments intended to show that the soul survives death. He began not by asserting, but by examining common beliefs and testing them in sequence. One of his first moves was to offer the argument from opposites. He asked his companions to consider how things come to be. Living things, he said, pass from being alive to being dead. Where there is life, death follows, and where there is death, life sometimes follows. If heat comes from cold and cold from heat in a cyclic way, then life might come from death and death from life in the same way. He meant to show a pattern of natural reversals that suggested continuity. The point was not presented as a final proof. It aimed instead to encourage the listener to see that the existence of living beings presupposes an interplay of states, and that the soul might persist through changes of bodily condition. Another line of argument appealed to recollection. Socrates asked whether learning could be mere acquisition of new things, or whether it might, in some cases, be remembering. He pointed to the capacity of persons to recognize equality in different instances. When two sticks are judged equal, he suggested, the mind compares them to a standard of equality not found in either stick, but already present in thought. If knowledge depends on memory of some prior form of the thing known, then minds must have had contact with those forms before birth. This suggested to him that souls had existed before their present bodies, and would therefore survive their ending. The argument moved by careful questions and by formal steps rather than by dramatic claim. He also offered what later readers would call the affinity argument. He distinguished between things that are composite and divisible and things that are simple and invisible. Bodies belong to the former category. They decay and break into parts. The soul, he argued, belongs to the latter. If the soul is simple and not subject to physical breakdown, then death, which affects the body, cannot destroy what is of a different and simpler kind. In this way, he sought to show that the nature of the soul made it likely to persist. Throughout these exchanges, he checked each premise and listened to objections. Simmias and Cebes, two careful interlocutors, raised questions and supplied counterexamples. At times, they worried that the soul might be like a tune played on an instrument, dependent on the body, as a kind of instrument that, when destroyed, would silence the tune. Socrates answered by refining his distinctions and by offering analogies of a different character. He insisted that the soul's relation to the body was not like music to an instrument in every respect. He pressed the inquiry until each objection had been considered and some reply given. As the day moved on, the conversation took moral turns. Socrates linked the question of the soul's fate to the care of the soul in this life. He said that a person who has lived well need not fear death because the soul, by its nature, seeks truth and wisdom. A mind practiced in philosophically examination, he argued, has prepared itself for release from bodily distraction. The friend who had learned to value reason and virtue, therefore, had reason to be composed about passing. In this way, the philosophical conversation served both as inquiry and as consolation. Near the end of the hours allowed, the practical preparations for the execution began. A guard entered with the hemlock. He explained how the drink would act. Paralysis would begin at the feet and gradually reach the chest. Speech and movement would fail in due course. Those present heard the description and received time to speak with their friend. Socrates continued to move in the calm manner that had long characterized him. He washed himself where he could. He ate a small amount of food when it was offered. He spoke about ordinary matters with humor at times, and he answered questions about last arrangements with the same steady care as before. The final moments, as recorded by one of his followers, were composed and marked by a kind of practical clarity. He lay down at the invitation of the officials, and as the paralysis spread, he remained attentive to the people around him. When his voice failed, he gave instructions through the last available gestures. He maintained his calm even when his breathing became difficult. At one point he joked, as he had on other occasions, with Crito about a small debt owed to a healer of the kind, associated with thanksgiving for recovery. His words were simple and matter-of-fact. He asked that a cock be offered to Asclepius, the god associated with healing, and he did not ask for pity or protest. That brief request carried multiple readings. Some saw in it a final confirmation of his belief in the soul's better condition after death. Others sensed a concern for ritual propriety and for the completion of common duties. As the paralysis reached his chest, the room quieted. His friends gathered close and heard what the weakened voice could still manage. He spoke of the parting in tones that mixed affection and instruction. He urged them to look after one another's souls, to practice the method they had learned, and to keep their attention on what reason and justice demanded. He asked them not to grieve extravagantly, and not to seek to glorify him with false honors. In this way, he repeated, in his last words, the concerns that had guided his life: care of the soul, fidelity to principle, and the avoidance of vain displays. When speech became impossible, he laid his head on the cushion and made a small movement that showed he was entering the state the guard had described. His body grew still in stages. Those nearest him observed the familiar sequence of loss of movement, the slowing of breath, and the final cessation. They reacted with the mix of sorrow and acceptance that accompanies the end of a life lived in a public way. Some wept quietly. Others held firm to composure, so they could attend to ceremonial duties and to the last practical requirements. After the body fell into stillness, friends took care of the arrangements that followed the city's rules. They wrapped what they could, they spoke in low tones, and they moved between grief and the necessity of action. The final scene left behind not only the memory of a single death, but also the materials of a continuing discussion. For those present, the combination of Socrates' reasoned refusals, his willingness to obey the city's law, and the calm demeanor of his final hours became subjects for reflection. In this way, the ending of his life flowed into questions his friends would carry forward. Those questions would not be settled by the day or by the body's final stillness. They would shape memories and arguments in the years to come. Meanwhile, the immediate sequence of events moved from the intimate circle in the prison to the broader business of the city, and then outward into the places where students and friends would tell what they had seen. In the next part of the narrative, these aftereffects will be traced as memory and interpretation spread, and as the influence of a life examined in public took on new forms. Those questions would not be settled by a single moment or by the rites that followed a life. They moved into speech and writing, into the classrooms and homes where pupils repeated what they had heard, and into disputes that tested common beliefs. One of the first and most direct attempts to preserve that speech was a series of writings by a young man who had been a devoted student. Plato wrote dialogues that put his teacher at the center of discussion. In these pages, Socrates speaks again, asking and answering, pressing companions to explain and to justify their beliefs. The works are arranged as conversations rather than as systematic treatises. In this way, the method that had given Socrates his shape was itself recorded. Plato's dialogues perform several duties at once. They show how Socrates moved through an argument, how he used questions to uncover assumptions, and how he drew people to examine their lives. They also preserve, in varying degrees, an image of Socrates that is shaped by Plato's own thought. Early dialogues are often close to the tone of public conversation he had known. Later ones take a different cast, as Plato develops his own philosophical theories. Readers and listeners have long debated where the voice of the historical man ends and the voice of the student begins. For the friends who heard the words, the effect was not primarily academic. It was a living memory of someone who had made inquiry a practice. For later readers, the dialogues became a way of learning not only what was said, but how to speak and how to listen. Plato did more than write. He established a place where philosophical life could continue in a sustained and collective form. Around the middle of the 4th century BCE, he founded what became known as the Academy. It was a school in the sense that it gathered students for regular study. It also functioned as a community where conversation and instruction shaped habits of mind. Mathematics, dialectic, and moral inquiry were taught side by side. Over time, the Academy transformed the practice of philosophy from sporadic, street-level engagement into a sustained discipline. That change altered how philosophy was pursued. It allowed ideas to be examined over years, to be passed from teacher to student, and to be tested against a wider range of thought. The Academy's work spread the influence of the Socratic manner, even as it introduced systematic structures. Students learned to argue in ways that valued clarity and rigor. They practiced questioning and learned to distinguish between different kinds of explanation. Meanwhile, other centers of learning emerged, and the broader Greek world adopted a variety of approaches. The transformation was not uniform. Some teachers emphasized the theoretical developments that grew from Plato's later work. Others sought to recover the more practical, conversational habits that had descended from the original meetings in the marketplaces and private houses. In this way, the legacy of one man's practice became plural. It produced schools that agreed in method at some points and disagreed in others. Aristotle was among those who received this inheritance. He arrived at the Academy as a young man and remained a student for nearly 20 years. He admired the rigor of inquiry he encountered there, though he took a different path in several important respects. Where Socrates had emphasized the form of questioning, and where Plato developed metaphysical theories, Aristotle turned to close observation and systematic classification. He attended to the natural world, to logical form, and to the structures of argument. Yet his work continued a thread that ran back to his master's insistence on reasoned examination. He believed that good thinking required clear terms, careful distinctions, and an attention to evidence. In this way, he kept a spirit of Socratic inquiry alive, even as he changed its methods. Aristotle later founded his own school, often called the Lyceum, and there he pursued teaching in a methodical fashion. His students carried out investigations, collected data, and worked through problems in ethics, politics, logic, and natural science. The aim was practical as well as intellectual. Ethics, for example, was treated not only as a subject for theoretical definition, but as a field where human practices and habits mattered. The question, how should one live, persisted in his work, and he sought answers that combined general principles with attention to ordinary life. In this respect, Aristotle's contributions show continuity with the Socratic concern for conduct, even while they introduce new emphases on evidence and classification. Over the centuries, the figure of Socrates acquired a symbolic weight that reached beyond any single school. He came to stand for intellectual integrity in a recognizable way. The image was simple and forceful. A man who refused to speak deceitfully, who preferred questioning to rhetorical flourish, and who accepted the consequences of his choices, came to be admired across very different traditions. That admiration did not always follow a single reading of what he had taught. Sometimes he was praised for a stubborn courage. At other times, he was presented as a model of moral humility. In both cases, the common element was a willingness to place truth and principle above ease and reputation. This symbolic role allowed later thinkers to claim Socrates as an ancestor for varied kinds of moral seriousness. Christian writers, for instance, found in his life and example resources that could be integrated with their own faith. In the first centuries of the Common Era, Christian thinkers engaged with Greek philosophy as they sought to express their beliefs in a language that was intelligible and persuasive to learned audiences. Plato's writings, and through them, the figure of Socrates became part of that conversation. Some church fathers used Platonic categories to describe the soul and its relation to God. Others admired the moral resolve Socrates displayed, and they drew lessons about the primacy of conscience and about fidelity to conviction. Over time, the engagement with Socratic themes shifted with historical needs. In the Middle Ages, certain Platonic ideas circulated through Christian thought in the form adapted by Neoplatonism. Monastic schools preserved texts and passed on methods of argument and interpretation. Meanwhile, Renaissance humanists rediscovered classical sources and emphasized a renewed study of human conduct and responsibility. Figures in the Renaissance looked to the past to recover practices of deliberation and moral inquiry that they believed cultivated civic virtue. Socrates, as mediated by Plato and by other intermediaries, became a figure who could be invoked for a life of thoughtful public engagement. In this way, the influence of one man's questions moved through institutions, both religious and secular. The persistence of the question, how should one live, is perhaps the most direct trace of Socrates' continuing presence. That question has appeared in many guises. Legal codes, religious teachings, philosophical treatises, and personal admonitions have all registered a version of the same concern. Sometimes the question is treated as a problem of moral rules. Sometimes it becomes an inquiry into character and habit. At other times, it takes the form of political discussion about the kind of institutions that support a good life. The question's survival shows not only the endurance of a problem, but the flexibility of a method. By refusing settled answers, and by valuing careful examination, the Socratic approach invited generations to pose the question anew. The method also encouraged self-scrutiny. It prompted individuals and communities to interrogate their own presuppositions. In this way, public life and private practice were linked. A city that permitted open question fostered habits of reflection among its citizens. Conversely, a culture of unquestioning adherence tended to narrow the range of acceptable thought. Over time, the balance between these tendencies shifted in different places. In some eras, the spirit of inquiry thrived. In others, it was constrained by political or religious pressures. Even so, the basic practice of asking and testing remained available as a resource for those who sought it. Socrates' calm resistance in the face of forces that demanded conformity, his refusal to give up questioning, his insistence on speaking plainly, and his acceptance of legal penalties came to matter as an ethical example. It suggested a model of conduct where intellectual honesty and civic obligation could coexist, though not without tension. For many later readers, that example provided a standard against which public and private actions could be judged. It became a point of reference in debates about education, conscience, and the limits of obedience. Those references multiplied as institutions of learning and systems of thought absorbed and reworked the materials of Greek inquiry. Schools taught forms of argument. Religious traditions adapted philosophical categories. Political theorists examined the relation between the individual and the state. Each of these developments carried traces of the original questions and the original manner of questioning. In this way, one life continued to exert pressure on the conscience of communities that were often distant in time and place from the streets of Athens. The transmission was not mechanical. Ideas were interpreted, contested, and reshaped to meet new concerns. Yet certain habits persisted: a care for definitions, a demand for reasons, and an attentiveness to the relation between belief and action. These habits sustained conversations about virtue, knowledge, and social life. Meanwhile, students and teachers kept asking how the old questions applied to new situations. They inquired about the responsibilities of rulers and of citizens, about the nature of justice in changing economies, and about the purposes of education in societies with different aims. Through these continuities and changes, the influence of Socratic inquiry continued to be felt. It informed debates about law and conscience, about the scope of public speech, and about the character of moral judgment. For some, these traces were primarily intellectual. For others, they had a moral weight. In either case, the effect was cumulative. Over successive generations, the practice of questioning and the value placed on examined life became part of cultural habits. They appeared in classrooms, in sermons, in legal discussions, and in the private deliberations of those who took their actions seriously. So the story moved forward, carried by writings, by schools, and by people who read and taught them. Those who had known Socrates directly were gone, but their words and practices lived on in the texts and institutions they helped to create. The voice that had once asked difficult questions in the marketplace found new outlets. It appeared in classrooms, in treatises, and in the careful habits of thought that later teachers sought to instill. In this way, the inquiry that had once been a personal practice became a public inheritance, and it continued to shape the concerns of those who followed. The narrative now turns to specific moments and figures where this inheritance took new forms, and to the ways in which the question, "How should one live?" was taken up in other languages and other frameworks. The story of Socrates closes in a simple way. He did not leave books or riches. Instead, he left a practice of careful questioning and a plain claim that examined life matters. That practice was taken up by friends, placed in dialogues, and taught in schools. Over time, it shaped habits of thought in many different places. What lasted was not a single doctrine, but a method and a tone. People learned to ask for reasons, to test their beliefs, and to consider how actions fit with principles. Meanwhile, institutions preserved and adapted those habits. Teachers returned to old questions and fitted them to new circumstances. In this way, the concern with how to live continued to matter. The influence was practical as well as intellectual. Citizens, students, and religious thinkers found in the example of steady inquiry a model for honest speech and conscientious action. At moments of trial and deliberation, the idea that one should answer to reason rather than to rhetoric-guided choices. Over generations, that guidance remained available, even when other voices were louder. You can carry this simple inheritance with you. Consider one clear question: how should I live? Hold it calmly. Ask it in small ways and answer as you can. Let careful thought guide modest steps. In the quiet of daily life, practice a readiness to listen and to give reasons for what you do. Now allow your mind to settle. There is no hurry to resolve everything at once. Rest with the awareness that thoughtful questioning has been part of human life for many centuries, and that it can be taken up again tomorrow. Good rest.